Well, Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens were not the first ones to come up with the idea of the Jewish war and accusing Israel of all the malaise of the world. In fact, they took a page straight from the Soviet playbook. We know all about narrative manipulation today and how informational warfare is designing the way we think and feel about wars and conflicts, no less, even to a larger extent, than the war on the battlefield. So we have a historian today, Holocaust expert, Soviet Union expert, who would shed light on this phenomenon, especially in the Soviet Union, and how narrative manipulation was used against Jewish people and how it reflects today. Don't miss out, it's going to be an amazing episode. I'm Or Yissachar. Welcome back to Underscore. Don't miss a moment. Hit the subscribe button right now and be the first to watch the next episode. Well, today's guest will shed light with us on this phenomenon called narrative manipulation or disinformation, depending how you want to call it. When I listen to Tucker Carlson today, I hear and ring much of the Soviet propaganda, even the propaganda from the Nazi Germany era. And look, I don't want to, the overused card of anti-Semitism and everything is anti-Semitism. Not every criticism of Israel, and for that matter, any government, is anti-Semitism, needless to say. But what happens when it becomes obsessive, when it becomes twisted, when narrative manipulation is used, even allegedly bought for by some actors? And so we want to learn more from history, especially the Soviet Union, and in general in history, how narrative manipulation was used against the Jewish people. I'm going to read out to you maybe what Tucker said just this week in his episode, because he, of course, is against the war that the United States and Israel are now conducting against the Iranian regime. I'm reminding you that Saudi Arabia was among the most vocal voices. Tucker said, why did the Iran war happen? Quote, this happened because Israel wanted it to happen. This is Israel's war. So Israel first stirs instead of America first stirs. All of these have become quite common. He says war on behalf of Israel because Bibi Netanyahu demanded it. Well, Candace went the extra mile, calling it the Zionist-occupied Trump administration. Let it kick in for a second. The Zionist-occupied Trump administration. So Jews across history have been perceived as useful pariahs, but we want to delve to the facts and history of it all. With us today is László Bernát Veszprémy. He's a historian. At the age of just 33, he's already written 6 books, and that's just the beginning. Quite amazing. Most recent of which is Bereft of Counsel, the Jewish Leadership in Hungary and the Holocaust, 1944 to 1945, published with Yad Vashem, of course, the International Institute for Holocaust Research. Hi, László. Welcome to Underscore.
Hi, thank you for the invitation.
Thank you for being here. So, László, I guess the first question I'm going to ask you is, when you hear all these voices and claims today about Jewish people instigating wars and pulling the West into wars and how they, in fact, initiated their own destiny of being persecuted, you look at the Soviet Union, the Holocaust era, does that ring familiar to you?
Well, of course. Anti-Semitism has been around for a very long time. And I don't want to say that all anti-Semites are stupid, because unfortunately a lot of them are actually quite smart, but they are not particularly creative people. They tend to reuse and go back to certain tropes and certain accusations that have been floating around for a very long time. So when you look at the anti-Semitic discourse and the anti-Israel discourse that is coming from people you mentioned, like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens and other influencers or journalists or politicians like that, you will very often find that they are reusing stuff that the Nazis or the Soviet communists or other communists around the world, like Hungarian communists, used to say. They take what they like, they discard what they don't like. They're going to pick particular accusations and kind of level them against Israel today. So there was no Israel in 1933 when the Nazis came to power, but they still somehow claimed that Judea had declared war against Germany. That was one of the big Nazi propaganda stories, that the Jews had declared war on Germany. They said that because some Jewish organizations had started boycotting the Third Reich, Nazi Germany. And then this accusation is again, coming up today, people will have you believe that somehow Israel started this conflict with Iran and with Hamas and Hezbollah, that Israel was the aggressor and not the one who was attacked on the 7th of October, 2023. So this is, for example, something that is straight out of the Nazi playbook. They took this accusation, they turned it around a little bit, and now they're using it for their own purposes. But I would like to talk about this in detail. But another thing that the Soviet Union has used a lot, particularly their historians, in their history books, was that the Jews, and especially the Zionists, had collaborated with the Nazis, and that they kind of did. The Jews did the Holocaust to themselves, or at least they were helping the Germans and the other countries who were involved in the Holocaust do it. That the Jews are themselves to blame for anti-Semitism, that they're causing anti-Semitism themselves. And this is something that you can see regarding the 7th of October. Again, Palestinian influencers paid by Qatar or who had connections to Russia, they were pushing this narrative that the Jews attacked themselves, that the IDF killed those poor innocent people who were in fact murdered by Hamas and other terrorist organizations. So this is something that they had already used in history. So there was this accusation that the Jews did the Holocaust, and they just switched the Holocaust to the 7th of October, and they switched the Jews to the Israelis and the IDF, and now they're just using it again. So like I said in the beginning, they're not particularly creative. They're just using these old tropes and accusations and kind of changing them to fit their own purposes right now.
Needless to say, and I'm actually shocked to hear that, because we know of the accusations that Israel actually was behind October 7, that Israel did it to itself. In fact, I heard it personally from several journalists and members of parliament around the world. I had multiple meetings and interviews over the past 2.5 years since the October 7 massacre. I was personally shocked to encounter it on a personal basis. In fact, one member of parliament in Europe said it to my face. Don't you think it's obvious that you did it? You're behind it because now you're occupying Gaza and you want to promote the one-state vision. And after my initial shock, I said, you know what? Jews can never be just victims. There needs to be like a mysterious reason behind it, as opposed to just terrorist attacks in Europe where you got perpetrators who are to be accused, not the victims. And it's shocking that, and you're saying that even back in the Second World War, while Jewish people were, butchered in extermination camps and concentration camps, they were accused of instigating their own Holocaust.
Well, I would say that this really gained momentum after the end of the Second World War. So especially if we look at the example of Hungary, which I have obviously done the most research on, you will find that the discourse regarding the Holocaust had very quickly turned from a discussion of victimhood and how the Jews were the victims of fascism. Initially, let's say around the creation of the State of Israel, and the first few years after the war, the communists still couldn't see very clearly where Israel was going to stand in the coming conflict with the free world, right? And Israel back then was when it was founded, it was a left-wing majority. I mean, politically, it was founded by socialist Zionists. Ben Gurion was a socialist, and there were all these discussions about the socialist lifestyle on the kibbutzim and things like that. And initially, the Soviet Union was supportive of the creation of the State of Israel, and so were the other socialist countries like Hungary. But of course, they very quickly realized that Israel was going to stand on the side of the United States. Officially it was a neutral country, but it was, of course, very strongly connected to the West, and it was on the side of France and the United States in the emerging Cold War conflict. And then the Soviet Union and its satellites like Hungary, socialist Hungary, they turned against Israel. And of course, being a totalitarian dictatorship, the historical discourse and what people were learning in schools, what was appearing in newspapers, the monuments they were creating, so everything related to memory politics had to fit this narrative, right? The Jews could not just appear as victims of fascism. They made this kind of distinction. I would call it a fake distinction. They weren't very serious about it. They said that they were not attacking Jews, they were attacking Zionists. this is again something that you can,
Right.
of course, see nowadays. They're saying the exact same stuff, that we don't have a problem with Jews, we only have a problem with Zionists. But of course, at the end of the day, all of their targets, when it came to the anti-Israel discourse, all of their targets were Jewish. The language they were using was anti-Semitic. And if you look at the documents of the Hungarian police and the secret police, because Hungary had a change of system in 1989, so we have become a democracy, and the archives of the Hungarian secret service and the police are more or less open for research. So you can actually see what these communist secret service agents and handlers were writing to each other and saying in their reports, and you can see that they basically saw every Jew in Hungary and all the Jews around the world as potential agents of Israel, as potential Zionists, simply because they were Jewish. So this was very, very clearly explained in the memos of the Hungarian Communist Secret Service, that every Jew secretly has this nationalist feeling. This they called it reactionary, right? Because anything connected to religion or nationalism was for them, against progress. So therefore reactionary. So they said that Jews are inherently and just because of their Jewish identity and their Jewish birth, are reactionary because they are nationalists, religious, Zionist people, or who have these lingering Zionist notions. None of them can be trusted, and they basically saw the very, very basic parts of Jewish life as part of a Zionist conspiracy. What am I talking about here? For example, they monitored Torah, Talmud schools in Hungary. They monitored people who were following the Jewish commandments, the mitzvot. They were monitoring people who had Jewish weddings, who had their boys circumcised. Everything that was somehow related to Jewish life was seen as part of a wider Zionist conspiracy. So I'm explaining this all just to illustrate that when they said that they were only against Zionism and the so-called imperialist goals of Israel, what they were actually fighting was basically just Jewish life. They wanted Hungarian Jews to assimilate, they wanted Hungarian Jews to become communists, to become atheists, to not feel any kind of connection to the Jewish state and to openly stand up against Zionism and Israel. But the ironic thing is that even when Hungarian Jews did that, even when Hungarian Jews joined the party and tried to fight against Zionism and Israel on the side of socialist Hungary, they were still not trusted. They were still being monitored, especially after the revolution of 1956. The Communist Party of Hungary started kicking out Jews from leading positions. Only 1 or 2 Jews could remain because they didn't trust them. The Soviet type of anti-Semitism had very strongly penetrated Hungary. And even though they were saying that they were not anti-Semitic, I think we can very safely say that basically everything they were doing was anti-Semitic, and this is also something which you can see today, because of course it all started with the protests. I mean this recent wave of anti-Semitism, it goes way back, but this recent wave of anti-Semitism, it started with the protests against the Gaza war, but then they started attacking synagogues, people wearing the Star of David necklace or wearing a kippah, yarmulke, at the end of the day, they are just opposed to Jewish life anywhere, because they're opposed to it in Israel, they're opposed to it in the diaspora. So where are Jews supposed to go? At the end of the day, they just don't want to see Jewish life anywhere. So when they're saying that they're not anti-Semitic, it's obviously a lie, and their actions speak for themselves. So you have to look at what they're doing and not what they're saying that their intentions are. Because when their actions just basically try and stop and destroy Jewish life everywhere around the world, and we just have to call out what it is. It's anti-Semitism, and it's very, very often a genocidal kind of anti-Semitism.
Right, and when you look for anti-Semites today around the world, look no further than people who, hide behind titles such as anti-Zionism. We can see today stickers in restaurants, no entry for Zionists. And as you said, they're not just protesting a policy by the Israeli government, they're also blocking Jewish students from entering, whether it is Yale University or Harvard University, attacking Jewish students, waving the flags of Hezbollah, which is, an organization founded on anti-Semitic roots. And so while we don't want to accuse anyone criticizing Israel for being anti-Semitic, and I criticize the policy of the Israeli government at times, quite severely. But that's relating to certain policy items, just like in Hungary you have it, or in the United States you have it around immigration, around economy. But here we're talking about targeting Jewish people, and you mentioned the Soviet Union. Assimilation is a positive thing. I think it's a role of a state to serve as a melting pot. We see the opposite case, the antonym, if you will, the antithesis among Islamist communities in Europe that made the point of not assimilating and forming their own, state within a state, if you will. But then the Jewish people, the ones who were the first to attempt to assimilate and give themselves European first names and assimilate in the economy and the rest of it, have found themselves the target of the same old accusation. And I honestly, this is classic communist tactic, right? To wipe off your previous identity and to subjugate the entirety of your identity to the state and its purposes, not your liberty and your purposes. And I want to quote from your book, Bereft of Council, because it's a fascinating one. Quote, "The communists soon realized that the Jewish councils were ideal targets for highly publicized show trials to distract the masses from the daily misery and terror. Some were simply squeezed by the regime and then let go. In June 1945, that's after, said the Second World War, the People's Prosecutor's Office in Kaposvar launched an investigation against Ödön Antal when they tried to prove that he had contributed to Hungary's war efforts as a leading timber merchant who had also shipped timber to Germany, carried out death sentence, and so they continue to accuse other prominent Jewish figures." And you're saying what you're hearing today is really reminiscent of the accusations against Hungarian Jews at the aftermath of World War II.
Well, you mentioned a number of things that I would like to react to. Sure. So you mentioned criticism of Israel. Well, of course, any country can be criticized, and also the communists in Hungary said that they were not necessarily opposed to Jewish life in the Holy Land or Palestine, as they called it. But at the end of the day, Hungary was inviting terrorists. At the same time, they were inviting terrorists, Palestinian terrorists, Arab terrorists to Hungary, gave them military training. They gave weapons to these people. So again, this was a classical case of Soviet double talk. I mean, on the one hand, Hungary had a big rabbinical seminary, the only rabbinical seminary in the entire Soviet bloc, which was state supported and funded. So officially, the socialist Hungary was saying that, we support Jewish life, etc., etc. At the same time, they were inviting terrorists to Hungary to give them military training. So again, it's very important to look at the actions and not the propaganda. So this was the kind of criticism of Israel that was not opposed to Jewish life. I mean, they were training Palestinian terrorists to kill Jews. Well, assimilation, assimilation can be a positive thing. Also, it can at the end of the day, lead to the dissolution and the end of Jewish life when people stop following the commandments. I personally believe that there's basically no Judaism or Jewishness outside of the Torah. Of course, it's also people can be ethnically Jewish, but at the end of the day, you gotta marry Jewish and raise your kids Jewish if you want to have a Jewish community and continuing Jewish life. So what the communists at the end of the day, like I said in the beginning, they weren't stupid people. They said that they saw the destruction of religious life. This is also true for Christianity in Hungary, but they saw the destruction of religion, which was one of their goals, as a transgenerational thing. They said that, we're thinking in terms of 50 years, 100 years, 150 years. They could never imagine that their rule in Hungary would only last about 40 years and that the Soviet Union would fall apart. They thought that they had infinite time. And, they wanted to go step by step. They took 2 steps forward and 1 step backwards. That's what they were saying, that, you give them a little bit of freedom, but then you also slowly try and steer people away from religion, be it Christianity or Judaism. At the end of the day, they wanted each generation to be less religious than the one before. So at the end of the day, this kind of assimilation that they were forcing, they just wanted to do away with Jewish life in Hungary, not at once and not in the scope of a few years, but within decades. They wanted Hungarian Jews to all assimilate in this big red melting pot, where at the end of the day everybody becomes an atheist comrade, and they're sinking the international together.
Yeah, we kind of have our own thoughts about the red melting pot. We want to stay away from it.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
and you mentioned this quote. I think it's an important quote from my book about the Jewish councils, because my book, which had just appeared at Yad Vashem, it deals with the so-called Jewish councils, or Judenräte in German. And maybe if the listeners don't know what this is, it's useful to explain it in a few sentences. Well, the Nazis put in motion many ploys and schemes to destroy the Jewish people, and one of the most violent and evil parts of the Holocaust was the creation of the Jewish councils, which was that when they occupied a country, in each city which had a Jewish community, or each town, they banded together the leaders, the rabbis, the congregational leaders, Zionist leaders, and they forced them, they told them to create these so-called Jewish councils, which were basically a group of Jewish elders and leaders who were communicating with the Jewish people, who were usually herded together into ghettos. So they were communicating in the ghettos, they were leading within the ghettos, and the Nazis were talking to them, and through them they were communicating with the Jews. So the Jewish leaders were themselves forced to take part in the deception of the Jewish people, because of course they were not told that they were going to be killed. They were told that they were going to be taken away for manual labor, and they were told that they could keep their families together, and that is why the children and the elderly also and the sick, they also had to be deported along with them. This was a very evil ploy, which basically forced these poor Jewish leaders to take part in the process of the Holocaust. But it's very important to emphasize that, of course, most of them did not want to do this, but they were forced to do this. So they were acting under death threats. Many of them were executed. Of course, these Jewish council leaders and their family members were often also killed at the end. So right. when I was looking for memoirs of Hungarian Jewish council leaders, I just had to realize that there weren't that many, because most of them had also died. They were usually the last ones to be killed, but at the end of the day, they were also murdered. Many of these leaders actually came from a more wealthy families. It was actually a very, very common thing in Hungarian Jewish communities that the congregational leaders were wealthy people. Simply because they assumed that these people would not want to take money from the congregation, they would give money to it. So many of these people were rather well off, and the Hungarian police made sure to torture these people very thoroughly and seriously before they were deported, because they wanted to take away all their money. And they assumed that these rich Jews had hidden their money, so they were torturing them. And when they didn't give any information, they tortured their wives. And when their wives didn't give any information, they tortured their children in front of them. So I'm just trying to describe that being the president of a Jewish council, or being a member of a Jewish council was not a privilege. It was not such an amazing thing. It's not that these people were all saved and rescued. No, in fact, they often went through worse things than. I'm not trying to create levels of how bad the Holocaust was for each Jew, but when you're a Jewish council leader, chances are very high that they tortured your children in front of you, trying to get you to give them your hidden Jewish money. The Hungarian police did that. The collaborationist police. They have very blood-curdling, terrible descriptions of these events. So it wasn't a privilege. It wasn't a privilege. And
no, and I think, László, today people use it often as an accusation. Is that correct? Like saying, you guys were colluders, you were collaborators with the Nazis, and you did it to yourself, basically. There was a Jewish Holocaust that you perpetrated, and voila, la preuve, the proof is that you guys ran so-called Jewish councils in collaboration with the Nazis. And what they failed to mention, as you said, is that these people were blackmailed, they were threatened upon, their families were tortured, and they basically had no choice but to do as they were told.
Well, this was definitely the case in Hungary. And, I did not go into the story in, let's say, Poland or the occupied Baltic states, because I'm not an expert. I've never done research on that. I tried to read the historical literature, and my impression is that in some of these areas, some of the Jewish councils, which had existed for years, were, let's say, maybe a little more deeply mired in collaboration, but that was not the case in Hungary. Why is that? The entire Nazi occupation of Hungary lasted just a little more than 1 year. So Hungary was occupied in March 1944, and the Soviet forces basically liberated Hungary by the beginning of April 1945. So, but the Holocaust was the big rural deportations because Budapest Jewry was not deported in the end to Auschwitz. The Nazis ran out of time, but everybody from the countryside, everybody was deported. So they basically did this in the scope of a few months. By the middle of summer, the deportations of Hungary were over. This was actually one of the fastest deportation actions in all of the history of the Holocaust. They have managed to deport more than 400,000 people in a matter of few months. It was absolutely amazing. I mean, in a bad sense of the word, it's just unbelievable that Hungarian bureaucracy, which is usually very slow and it's not easy to get Hungarian bureaucrats to do anything. But here they have actually managed to get the collaborationist bureaucrats to deport 400,000 people in a few months. It's
terrible.
It's absolutely. It was an unbelievable achievement from the point of view of the Nazis. They did not think that they would manage to do it. The Nazis, we had the letters which the Nazi leaders were exchanging with each other, and they said that it's unbelievable that we have actually managed we got the Hungarians to do this, and they did it themselves. It's very important to emphasize that the entire deportation crew of Adolf Eichmann, it was a few dozen people. Hungary had a population of 40 million people back then. It's unbelievable that the Hungarian bureaucrats collaborated to this extent. It's one of the worst cases of collaboration. But this also means that the Jewish councils in Hungary didn't have to do anything in a lot of places. They ran the ghetto. They were responsible for food, for shelter, for medication. They had to set up Jewish hospitals within the ghetto, but they did not really have a role in the deportations, and neither did the Jewish police. Also in Hungary, there was a Jewish police in the countryside, but they were not involved in the deportations because the deportations were carried out by the Hungarian police and the rural police and the Hungarian bureaucracy. Of course, the Germans were also, there in the country. They were occupying the country, but they had no real, they did not meet any real resistance or mass resistance for a very long time. At the end of the German occupation, some real resistance movement developed. And you have to give it to them that they actually, if you compare it with other countries, they developed pretty fast, these Hungarian resistance groups. I mean, in less than a year, they were showing signs of armed resistance. It's actually not bad, but they couldn't stop the Holocaust. And this also means that there's not a lot of blame that one can place on the Hungarian Jewish councils. Jewish councils were often blamed by the surviving Jews themselves after the war. I have read these accusations also in Hungary. There's a lot of memoirs which say a lot of bad things about the Jewish leaders, and I tried to check these accusations against the available archival documents, and I just had to find that the vast majority of the accusations were just basically groundless and did not hold up to proper historical scrutiny. It's not that you cannot blame or that you cannot criticize contemporary Jewish leaders, because of course you can. Some of them made mistakes, some of them were collaborationists, some of them tried to save themselves and their families, some of them stole money. But this is really like a very, very tiny portion of all the Jewish leaders who I have managed to inspect. And I'm rather proud of myself because I have managed to collect more than 150 Jewish councils in Hungary. To the best of my knowledge, no one has done this research before, so I had to go to all the rural archives and look through these. There's not a lot of documents, so I had to go through a lot of boxes in each of these rural archives to find at least a few pages which describe the actions of the local Jewish council. I mean, if there were any. This book required a lot of research, and I had to come to the conclusion that most of the accusations were simply not true, and a lot of these accusations were in fact inflated after the war years by Soviet propaganda or socialist propaganda in Hungary. Socialist historians, many of them who were actually Jewish themselves, but they're communists. So these communist historians, they blamed much of the Holocaust on the Jewish councils. Again, I don't think that these accusations were historically accurate. And they also came up with the lie that most Jewish councils in Hungary were run by Zionists. They started calling them the Zionist Jewish councils. So this was actually also something which I had to look into in my research. Is it true that Hungarian Jewish councils were run by Zionists? I mean, it's not impossible, but it was also pretty unlikely because Zionism in Hungary was just not a popular thing before the creation of the State of Israel and before the Holocaust. It's a fact that in a community of more than 700,000 Jews, the members of the Zionist movement were around 5,000 people. So it was a minority within a minority. It was not very likely that Jewish councils were run by Zionists, and I had to find that, of course, this accusation was again a piece of communist Soviet propaganda. There were some Jewish councils which had a majority of Zionist leaders, but this was very rare, and in most cases they were run by Orthodox Jews who were not Zionists or non-Zionists or even openly anti-Zionist Orthodox Jews. And also a great portion of these Jewish councils were run by assimilationists, so-called neologue people. Neologue Jewry is basically like conservative Judaism, but it's a special Hungarian branch because these people were very proud of being Hungarians. They were these ultra-patriotic Hungarians who kept saying that they were 110% Hungarians, who did not want to leave for the Holy Land, for Eretz Israel. They did not want to restart their lives and learn Hebrew and have Hebrew names. They thought that they were these full total Hungarians, and the Holocaust for them was something which really shattered their identity, because suddenly they had to realize that the Hungarian state no longer sees them as loyal Hungarian subjects, but that they want to deport them and destroy them. And this was something which has added as, let's say, a second layer of emotional suffering to these people. So I found that most Jewish councils in Hungary were run by Orthodox and neologue people and not by Zionists. There were some Zionist councils, but most of them were not so. And in fact, some of the best examples of resistance which I have found from Jewish councils came from the Zionists. I'm not going to say that all Zionists were in the resistance. I'm also not going to say that all anti-Zionists were collaborators, because you at the end of the day, you just have to treat each case as an individual case. You cannot make these general statements. Everybody had a different story. Everybody had their own tragic stories, but it's also worth it to point out that even though the communist propaganda said that the Zionists were all Nazi collaborators, and this is because they had this big story that Zionism is a kind of fascism, Nazism is a kind of fascism, and fascists love each other, right? So they cooperated.
We hear it today in France. In fact, when I studied there, is the Zionist fascist, vous êtes les terroristes, le Zionist fascist, you are the terrorists. And again, once again, being a Zionist today is considered a bad word in those progressive milieu. And it's really a bad word saying you are a Zionist. I even remember, there were multiple cases even recently. I'm not going to name names, but this actor from House who was grieving the death of his close Israeli actress. The Israeli actress was very close to him, and he said, yes, but you guys, there's no reason to suspect I'm a Zionist. Come on. So this has become like a cultural norm to be anti-Zionist, maybe popular, maybe more acceptable in those circles. But according to what you're saying, it goes back decades to the Soviet propaganda of using Zionism as a bad word and accusing Zionist collaborators of doing all of that to our precious state. I have to say, László, this is amazing and fascinating. To my knowledge, I don't know if anyone else did such an in-depth research of those Jewish councils in Hungary. Just out of curiosity, did you, because we are often victims of history and the way it's told, and some narratives have already got the status of common wisdom. And the question is really, we're not 500 years away from the Holocaust. We are 80 years away. It's not unthinkable that some people survived till today, maybe less and less as time goes by, but some did. Obviously, most of them are gone already. And as you said, most of them were already executed in real time. Question is, relying on documents exclusively can be tricky, as you said, because of the effort to rewrite history. Did you also use the privilege of you being Hungarian, speaking the language, going around the country, diving and delving into archives, but also meeting the people? Did you incorporate that in your research?
Well, it's very difficult to find Jewish survivors who had any role in the Jewish councils or the Jewish police, because most of these people were already grown-ups, right, at the time. So they were a certain age, and you have to add 80 plus years. So most of them have been dead for a long time. But I have actually managed to find a Jewish policeman. Well, policeman is a strong expression. I mean, he was basically a teenager. He was not even what was he, 13, 14? I don't remember. who was
Was recruited.
yeah, who was kind of a what you call it, a runner, like an errand boy for the Jewish police in one of the rural towns. So I managed to make an interview with him. We exchanged a lot of emails. So I did quote that, I think, in the Hungarian version of the book, because there's also a Hungarian version of the book. And what I found very interesting about his testimony was that he basically described being a Jewish policeman as nothing special, which is, from one point of view, understandable, because everybody who was involved with the Jewish councils tried to make their role or whatever they did seem not interesting, or like they didn't do anything. But I kind of had to believe him, because the Jewish police was established in Hungary, but at the end of the day they were not needed, because the Hungarian police and the Hungarian rural police, the so-called gendarmerie, at the end of the day they did everything that the Nazis wanted them to do and more. So what he basically described was that he was strolling around with the girls who were kind of attracted to him, because he had some kind of uniform of sorts, and he got extra rations of food. That was it. He said that as a child he thought that he had a really fun time. This is not the kind of stories that you're going to hear from the Baltic states of Poland, where the Jewish police were forced to deport their own community. Some of these people were forced to deport their own families. There's a memoir available from I think a Polish Jewish policeman, Kaliel or Zaliel from Betzalel. His name was Zaliel Perehodnik, and his testimony is titled "Am I a Murderer?" This Jewish policeman was forced to deport Jews with the promise that he would get to save his family. But at the end of the day, he had to put his own wife and kid on the trains. And it's a heartbreaking story, and you are going to find no such stories from Hungary, because the Jewish policemen were not used in the deportations. They were also put on the train like everybody else. So they were not forced to make these absolutely terrible and unimaginable, unfathomable acts or actions. And another person who I got to interview was the daughter of one of the Jewish council members of Budapest, who gave me a very interesting insight. She was very little during the Holocaust, so she basically didn't remember much, but she spoke a lot with her father about what he had done later in Israel, because her father moved to Israel. He was a religious Jew, and she spoke to her father, and who did not have a proper memoir. Her father never wrote a proper memoir, so this was very important for me, because through her description, through this discussion, I got to understand what her dad told her about his role. So this was a very good source of oral history on how Jewish council members saw themselves, or how they wanted people to see them after the war. So this was also useful. So I did get to do some oral history research, but it was very tricky, because most Holocaust survivors in Hungary were little children at the time, and they had nothing to do with the Jewish council, so they didn't know anything, or they didn't remember much, or what they thought they knew they kind of picked up from historical literature. It's again a kind of a source of confusion that people throughout the years and decades they read things, and then it's incorporated into their memories. So I was very, very happy that I could still talk to someone who had actually seen the Hungarian Jewish police in action and was part of it in some way, because I don't know if this gentleman is still alive, but this was probably one of the last few chances to talk to someone who had actually seen this with his own eyes.
Oh, what a mission. And of course, relatives, as in children of those survivors and witnesses, are often a good source. I know that Yad Vashem has been doing it quite a while. People who grew up with their parents talking, or rather, as you said, not talking at home, and then sort of squeezing some information, whatever information they could. And that certainly serves research, and really a blessing to serve this knowledge to next generation, so long as we can preserve it. So tell us about the Soviet propaganda, because you mentioned how the Soviets were busy rewriting history books and designating, or rather dubbing, those Jewish councils as Zionists and colluders, how the Jews actually did the Holocaust to themselves. And that goes back to how, certain claims in history are so much and so often repeated that they get inculcated in the brain and in the common culture. And and they become part of common wisdom. And I think the Soviets were world-class masters of this art called propaganda. They used narrative manipulation as really a state tool against their adversaries. And one of the things that was interesting to me was that to see like the equivalence in some of those narratives. For example, how the Soviets claimed that basically Jew, and that's a narrative that I'll be happy if you can elaborate on, a narrative that Zionists and Jewish people were actually advising secretly to Western governments behind the scenes, and so pulling them to the war against the Soviets and so on. How this was basically that's after World War II, right? The Soviet Union claiming how Zionist councils and organizations are behind social fragmentation in Eastern Europe. And we can hear this claim even during the Nazi era when Goebbels and Hitler themselves called it the Jewish War. They said that Jewish people were advising, how can you explain that both Stalin, Roosevelt, and Churchill are all three of them are united against us. All three have such converging, varying interests. So that rings as well today to those claims made by Tucker Carlson and Kenneth Owens and others saying Jewish advisors led President Bush to invade Iraq and Afghanistan. Those are Jewish advisors who today are demanding Trump to intervene in Iran. It is Israel that is pulling us to forever wars. And so this line in history is incredibly telling about how narratives start off as state propaganda and they become a natural part of our lives.
Well, you can absolutely see that they're reusing these old charges, that the Jews are doing it all to themselves. What was very surprising for me, that after the Bondi Beach shooting in Australia, even in Hungarian social media, these people who I'd never seen before, I don't know where they came from, they just started popping up. I'm not sure who's paying them, but someone has got to be paying them, and they were pushing this narrative that it was actually the IDF who started shooting Jews to death in Australia on this beach, and they even created these fake photos, probably with artificial intelligence. And my impression is that nowadays, basically, anything can happen in the world. I mean, you can think about the shooting of Charlie Kirk, you can think about the shooting in Australia, or natural disasters, or the Epstein files, or whatever, and there is going to be this kind of concentrated, well-organized media campaign spanning across countries and continents, immediately blaming it on the Jews and Israel. It seems like it's organized. I'm not sure by whom. I'm not an expert on this, but I have done some research into Soviet propaganda and anti-Zionist Soviet propaganda, especially in Hungary. And what I can definitely tell you is that none of the articles appearing in the Hungarian media at the time, none of the interviews which were happening on TV and radio, and this stuff before the internet. This was communication. This was reaching huge masses. Everybody was reading this stuff and listening to this stuff, and especially because Western newspapers and radio was banned in Hungary. You were not allowed to read and listen to Western media. In fact, you could go to prison for it. This was basically the only thing that was reaching people. And what I can tell you is that none of the articles and none of the interviews which were happening could happen without the supervision of the Hungarian Secret Service. If you look at the files of the contemporary Hungarian intelligence, and there was something called the department responsible for the fight against domestic reaction. They had a very fancy title, and what they were basically doing was they were fighting against all sort of non-communist or non-Moscow oriented political movements within Hungary, and this included everything from the Catholic Church to Jewish organizations to actual neo-Nazis to social democrats to liberals. So everybody was put into this category of domestic reactionary movements. And they were monitoring them. They were reading their letters. They were bugging their homes. They were bugging their phones, and they were trying to break up their circles to find division within their ranks and deepen these divisions and alienate people and isolate people. So they had this whole kind of Secret Service agency focusing on this, and you can read these files in the archives today. And they were very, very focused on the discussion around Israel. In fact, the documents state that Israel was one of the chief enemies or arch enemies of Hungary. Which is very interesting to see, because you would think that Hungary was not that involved in the Middle East. You would think that the United States would be like the nemesis, or the United Kingdom would be the nemesis, or West Germany. But one of the biggest targets of Hungary was Israel, and at least in this kind of propaganda. And whenever something happened in the world, they had their agents, they had the people they were paying or they were in touch with, or the party members. And unfortunately, some of these people, in fact, quite a few of them, were from the Jewish community. They were kind of token Jews used to spread these lies and misinformation. And they were immediately told to focus on Israel, to attack Israel, to say that Israel was behind the wars, that Zionism was behind the wars, that all the conflicts in the Middle East can basically be traced back to the creation of the State of Israel. Before the State of Israel, apparently the Middle East was this amazing, peaceful place. After the creation of the State of Israel, apparently everything had turned bad. And it's very, very strange to see these actual directives and orders in the documents of the handlers, because of course all the agents in Hungarian media, there were a lot of agents in media, and they all had handlers, right? They had these Hungarian Secret Service officers, who were not wearing uniforms, they were plainclothes officers, and who they were reporting to. And they got their orders usually written down on a piece of paper, and you can see that it's crazy that an article would appear in the Hungarian language Jewish media in Israel. They had this big newspaper. In fact, it still exists today. It was called Új Kelet, the New East. It's a very, very old Hungarian language newspaper in Israel. So they were, of course, reading every issue. And an article appeared there that they didn't like. So they had a Hungarian journalist react to it immediately in the Hungarian media, and they were told what to write. And then they reviewed the article together, and they decided if it was good or not, if something had to be changed or not. So these people were under very tight control, and the Hungarian Secret Service was actually, it was kind of irrational. They were like crazy focused on Israel and everything related to Zionism. From a certain point of view, it makes no sense, and that's what I'm saying. That it's I think it's at the end of the day, it's anti-Semitic, because even through if you want to see, as a kind of a historical experiment, you want to see things through the lens of the Hungarian communist state. You want to see it from their perspective, what were their interests and what were not serving their interests. I mean, even through that, you cannot explain this kind of mania, this kind of crazy obsession with Israel. Hungary had a sizable Jewish community even after the Holocaust. So that might explain the interest to some extent, but even that doesn't explain why the Hungarian Secret Service were so focused on this. And what I'm trying to get to at the end of the day is that after going through hundreds and hundreds of these files, and all of these files are very thick, hundreds of pages each file, and I've read through hundreds of these files in the Hungarian Secret Service archives, I just had to come to the conclusion that everything revolving around Israel, and everything around the discussion around the Middle East and the Arab countries and this entire Israeli-Palestinian conflict was very tightly controlled by the Hungarian Secret Service, who of course were basically, I'm not going to say that they were run by the KGB, but they were very, very strongly cooperating with the KGB. The Soviet embassy in Hungary was full of KGB officers who were regularly talking to the Hungarian officers. They had these common work meetings. They were what was called a friendly secret service. There were not a lot of friendly secret services, but some of them were in this category, and the Soviet Union's KGB was definitely in this category. So when they gave a request to Hungary, the Hungarian Secret Services immediately did it and tried to fulfill these requests. So at the end of the day, this very vile and evil and manipulative discussion around Israel and the Holocaust and the Jewish people in general in Hungary was very, very strongly controlled by the state and by the Secret Service. So nothing was an accident. It was very, very rare that something accidental would happen. Most of this stuff was no coincidence. It was directed and orchestrated. It was kind of a show for the people to see, the evil Jew show, which was in your newspapers and on your radio and on your TV every day. And Israel was very, very obviously pointed at as the source of most evil in the world, along with the United States, of course.
Well, why does it all sound too familiar, László? Well, we're all happy that Hungary today is a very different place, and in fact, Israel's strongest ally in Europe, and we're very grateful for it. But to go back to that era, To quote a quote attributed to Stalin and Beria, "Give me the man and I'll find you the crime." So that was a very convenient culprit, I would say. I would maybe finish up with two last questions for you. One is about the objective of the Soviets then and maybe Russia today of doing this, because it takes a state effort to promote all this propaganda and false narratives. And it seems like they're putting a lot of effort and thought into it. And some theories say, well, if you break the spirit, you break the people. And basically, it's a tool to fragment the West from within, with a lack of ability to defeat it in the battlefield. And if you use the Jews as a convenient culprit, as they always are used, well, what starts with the Jews never ends with the Jews, and anti-Semitism is means to break societal cohesion. Is that what you're seeing here, or do you think that the Soviet apparatus was genuinely anti-Semitic, just like Iran, the Iranian regime, genuinely interested in the demise of the Jewish people? Which is it in your opinion?
I don't think there's necessarily a contradiction there. I mean, you can be a convinced anti-Semite, and at the end of the day, you might want to look at the big picture and try and defeat the West. But when we talk about defeating the West, what we really mean is that they were trying to defeat capitalism, because this was a class war in their worldview. Everything related to Western culture, the Jewish Christian tradition, and Western values, they were just kind of products of capitalism, and of course they kind of saw this as steps leading somewhere, right? So if they wanted to attack Israel, they wanted to attack the Jewish people, they wanted to find breaks and sources of division in Western societies, and then they wanted to dig into these divides and deepen them and cause unrest. It didn't really matter for them what kind of unrest this was. In fact, occasionally you could see that they were supporting. I'm not talking about Israel right now, but occasionally they were supporting both sides.
Even the peace
if there was a if there was a conflict between, let's say, a neo-Nazi group and a communist group, they might have actually been financing both sides because they just wanted there to be conflict. They were very they were in a sense they were the students of Machiavelli. They didn't really care as long as their enemies were having a hard time. And
just like Israel regarded the Iran-Iraq war, we wish success to both sides, right? So. So there might not actually be a contradiction between anti-Semitism and seeing the West as the final target. But of course, what is also important to understand about contemporary Arab tactics and techniques and also, I guess, their secret services is that many of them were actually KGB trained. Many of them were received their training and learned these techniques. Techniques from the Soviet secret services. Many of these people received training in Hungary, for example. There's a lot of files about this, that Hungary was cooperating with Arab nationalist groups and terrorist organizations and Islamist groups. It didn't matter for them as long as they were attacking the West. So there were, of course, deep ideological contradictions there, because Hungary was supposedly against any kind of religion, and yet they were talking to Islamist fundamentalists. But they found some common ground in their hatred of Israel and the West, and a lot of these techniques today are very much like what they were doing back during the Cold War era, and it is not a coincidence. It's because they learned from the very same people who came up with these campaigns during the Cold War period. You can also see this with Russia. I'm sure that the Russian guys, I'm sure that their secret service have gone through some amazing developments, but at the end of the day, they're basically doing the same stuff. And not much has changed. Their enemies are basically still the same. I understand that Russia and Israel have, I'm not an expert on Russian issues, but I understand that they have a more complicated relationship nowadays with the Russian military presence in the Middle East. I understand that it's not as such a kind of open hostility which you could experience during, let's say, the war of attrition, when Israeli fighter planes were shooting down Russian planes, Soviet planes on the Sinai Peninsula. So it might have been
We might have seen worse periods in time, but also obviously Russia is pushing this anti-Israel narrative today. And I think one of the reasons why there seems to be so much anti-Semitism, especially online, is that right now there's just so many state actors interested in pushing the anti-Israel narrative. So it's coming from Russia, it's coming from China. You know, they run TikTok, and everybody knows that TikTok is a lot more supportive of anti-Israel content than pro-Israel content. So you're going to see a lot more of this pro-Palestinian stuff on TikTok. But it's also coming from Turkey, it's coming from Qatar, it's coming from Iran, it might be coming from Pakistan. You know, it's coming from a lot of countries. And another part of the problem is that, you know, in the past, the Western media used to be at least kind of pro-Israel, right? But nowadays, in fact, a lot of the media and the social media coming from Western countries is also pushing the pro-Palestinian narrative. So if I go on my own Facebook, then I'm going to see these contents coming from Chinese influencers and people probably paid by Russia and probably paid by other Muslim countries. But I'm also going to see the Turkish public media has a Hungarian edition for some reason. They're spending Turkish public funds on giving propaganda to Hungarians, and I would say that like 90% of the content is anti-Israel. But then we also have the German public media, which also has a Hungarian edition. The Germans also feel it's very important to spend their public funds and their euros on creating Hungarian language media, and it's also anti-Israel. So from Germany to Turkey to China to Russia, to Qatar and Pakistan, this kind of anti-Israel content is flowing in. And it's all just creates this impression that the anti-Israel movement is absolutely huge. And against that, you have some of these Israeli influencers, if they even reach the Hungarian audience. Some American influencers maybe, but a lot of those people are also anti-Israel, like Tucker Carlson. And then you have the Hungarian state media, which is generally pro-Israel, but compared to this huge mass of anti-Israel impulses and messages, it's really nothing. So one of the reasons why I think that the anti-Israel messages are just so easy to encounter and see today in social media is that so many actors are interested in pushing this nowadays. So I think pro-Israel voices are just outnumbered. So if somebody wants to do something with that, there needs to be more pro-Israel voices, and there need to be more influencers, or their voices need to be louder, because when there are different voices, opposing voices coming in from so many other sources, it's just difficult to counter this narrative.
Absolutely, and that's our job in this podcast to add light and add more voices to this conversation. As the American founding fathers said, the answer to hate speech is more speech, not necessarily censorship. And indeed, there are. It pays off to everyone to be anti-Semitic. I assume from Qatar through the Chinese government all the way down to Muslim Brotherhood. And I wouldn't expect, for example, China to be anti-Semitic in its government. But as you said, it's an extremely lucrative tool to divide the West and to create havoc and to create social disagreements. As you see the current situation with Israel and what it causes in between the right and the U.S. and so on. But aren't you glad, László, that we, the Jewish people, are the lowest common denominator for all of these actors that have so much disagreement in between them? And one final point, maybe, before I let you go, is the notion of Hungary today, and deviating a little bit from our original topic, but I remember you also visited us in Israel, and obviously visited many times, and Hungary today is perhaps Israel's strongest ally in the European Union. It has an extremely pro-Israel policy, ranging from banning outright pro-Hamas protests, as they are, inundating Western capitals from Paris to Washington. The Hungarian government honestly cracked down on pro-Hamas activists and supported Israel and the Jewish community, and even served as a shelter for some Israeli families at some point. All the way down to withdrawing from the ICC in The Hague after the really biased persecution and prosecution of Israeli officials. So all of that is quite astounding for a country that, as you said, has suffered in the past under communist regimes from this pattern. how do you explain what's going on in Hungary today, and what do you say about the next steps, about the future? Where are Hungary-Israel relations going from here?
Well, I wouldn't say that there's no anti-Semitism in Hungary, because if you look at the polls, then throughout the years, they show a very consistent pattern that around 30% of Hungarian population is basically anti-Semitic, and another 30% of the population believes in at least some anti-Semitic stereotypes, like, I don't know, the Jews run the banking system, or the Jews talk too much about the Holocaust, or whatever. But maybe you couldn't call them outright anti-Semites. So that's around 60% of the population. And then you have another around 30% of the population, or something like that, which is basically philo-Semitic. But that wouldn't explain this kind of politics, and it also wouldn't explain this phenomenon. So there seems to be this interesting contradiction that even anti-Semitic Hungarians just don't seem to be interested in going out to the street and attacking people. They might not like Jews, but they're not going to take it to the physical level. So we haven't had a lot of anti-Semitic atrocities, no murders, no beatings, no such stuff. So yeah, of course, we don't want to see any of that. But what I'm saying is that even anti-Semitic Hungarians seem to behave differently than, let's say, anti-Semitic Arab immigrants in the Western societies. Because they're going to be very happy to go out and attack Jews and try. Some of them will try to torch synagogues and burn synagogues, and some of them will try to shoot people, and some of them unfortunately succeed in doing that. The situation seems to be different in Hungary. Another part of this, or another cause of this phenomenon might be that Hungary hasn't had a lot of Islamic immigration, and lately we have had quite a bit of immigration because there's just not enough people to do all the jobs. But Hungary has kind of been trying to pay attention to inviting immigrants from non-Muslim countries. This doesn't always succeed. For example, a lot of the immigrants coming from India happen to be Muslims, but they hold Indian citizenship. And if you look at the latest census in Hungary, you're going to see that for the first time ever, now there are more Muslims in Hungary than Jews. So actually, this number has just changed in the past 1 or 2 years, and there are now more and more mosques popping up in Hungary. Some of them supposedly financed by the Muslim Brotherhood. So I don't want to say that the situation is perfect, because it's far from perfect, and we have also seen some of these flash mobs supporting the Palestinian cause. They're officially banned, but they have still managed to get them to do it. So the situation is far from perfect, but I would definitely say that if we had massive Islamic immigration in the past few years or decades, the situation would be a lot worse, because right now it's just that there's no real crowd. You might get 20 or 50 or 100 people together if you're really lucky, but you're not going to have, some of my friends that, for example, they live in Amsterdam. I used to live in Amsterdam. I have a lot of Dutch friends, and they send me these videos immediately after the 7th of October. That you could just see this endless mass of people flowing through the streets with the Palestinian flags and just yelling, anti-Semitic stuff. Some of them were yelling Allahu Akbar, and it's just chilling to see. It's unbelievable that you can get this many people together after such a brutal terror attack to support the perpetrators. You would never find anything like this in Hungary nowadays. And of course, it also, I suppose, to some extent, is related to the personal friendship between the Hungarian and Israeli political leaders. So if you add all of this together, then Hungary is definitely a better place right now for Jews than a lot of Western and Northern European countries. But I would also add that Hungary seems to be on the same road as the rest of the Western world, but we're just getting there more slowly. So it's a slower process, but I think we're basically on the same tracks. So I'm not very optimistic regarding that.
Perhaps to finish with an uplifting tone, like we like to do, briefly, if you could share your thoughts on, because we spoke a lot about disinformation and false narratives today. Do you see any hope for young people today to open up to new sources of information? What would you advise us to do?
Well, I'm not an expert on social media, but something which I've been thinking a lot lately about is that this kind of recent campaign to conquer the Republican Party in the United States, I think it's a very, very interesting process. And you can also see this in some European countries, that there are more and more openly anti-Semitic people popping up in right-wing parties, which is a very, very interesting. It's a new ground for them, because it used to be that, some, of course, they had some anti-Semites, but they were also anti-Semites who also hated Islam, and they also hated immigrants because they just hated everybody, right? So, but now what we have is this Tucker Carlson-like pro-Iran, pro-Palestinian, and right-wing anti-Semites. It's a very, very strange mixture, and I think it's again, I don't think that this stuff is a coincidence. I think somebody is deliberately experimenting with, can we conquer spaces where we previously had not had any ground? And the answer seems to be yes. You can, in fact, get some major Republican and right-wing influencers to hate Israel and to say more pro-Islam and pro-immigration and pro-Palestinian stuff, or even pro-Iran stuff. And there seems to be an audience for it. So, I think it would be very interesting to see what grounds can the pro-Israel discourse conquer. I mean, there might actually be groups who we never thought we could reach, but maybe we could be able to reach them. So, I think that it's important to never give up. My worldview, in spite of all the pessimist stuff I've been saying, is also very positive. At the end of the day, I read the Bible. I believe that the forces of good are going to win. I don't think that at the end of the day, these terrible and evil forces could win. I also believe that human nature is just very focused on liberty. So I believe that we have this inherent urge to be free. So all around the world and all throughout history, you're going to see that people have been escaping dictatorships to run towards a free world, but not a lot of people have been escaping the free world to live in dictatorships. So one of the biggest sources of weakness for these dictatorships and totalitarian regimes is that they just don't have the support of their own people. This is also one of the problems which you're seeing that the Russians are facing in the Ukraine, or also Iran is facing, that most people just don't want to live as slaves of a totalitarian regime. And this was also the problem of socialist Hungary, that evidently the people just did not want to live in a communist dictatorship, and they were constantly fighting this battle against their own people, who they knew hated them. They knew that there was just this mass hatred against them, so that's why they were using power. So at the end of the day, I think, for a number of reasons, ranging from my own religious convictions to practical, political, and historical reasons, I just don't think that at the end of the day, Russia or China or Qatar or Iran or whichever country we're talking about, that they're going to win. I think that at the end of the day, I'm not saying that everybody's going to live in a liberal democracy, because we have seen in a lot of places that some people just don't want to live in liberal societies that we live in, and that's also fine, because we're not trying to run their countries for them. I don't believe in this kind of exporting of American democracy in that sense, but I also don't believe that these mass murdering dictatorships are ever going to win. So I'm also positive. We must never give up. We must always stand up for our values and for Jewish, Christian tradition and liberty, we must not let these spaces be occupied by these madmen and these crooked people like Tucker Carlson and Candace Owens, or Nick Fuentes, for that matter, or any of these other left-wing lunatics, because now we seem to have the right-wing lunatics and the left-wing lunatics, and the common ground they find is the hatred of Jews in Israel. It's people just gotta stand up and fight these fights. I'm not on social media. I'm not an influencer, but of course I see these fights in academia all day. It's also a big fight among historians. It's also a big fight even among Holocaust historians. You would think that this would be a field that this pro-Palestinian discourse could not enter, but in fact it has entered it very, very strongly. Some of the most famous Holocaust historians, like Omer Bartov, he's Israeli, and yet still he's accusing Israel of genocide. And this is also happening in Hungary. So we all have our own battles to fight, but at the end of the day, I think we're going to win.
Absolutely, we will. László Bernát Veszprémy, thank you so much for joining _.
Well, thank you.